Good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining us today. Welcome to this Carnegie event. We're excited to have the second of two book talks about books that are in one way or another related to the global fight against climate change or protecting our environment. Last week we talked with a historian about the 19th century efforts to protect and conserve Yellowstone National Park as the first national park in the United States. And this week we take a totally different approach to the question of climate or the environment, and we talk about the 21st century imperative of confronting climate change with political philosopher Henry Shue, who has a new book out this year called The Pivotal Generation, in which he quite generously includes all people currently on Earth in the pivotal generation. We are all one generation in his reckoning. And it's an attempt to make a moral case for the imperative of climate action right now. I want to start by saying you might think those of us who read on climate are used to the feeling of overwhelming dread that comes with reading anything accurate about the climate crisis. But I want to start by reading just a few lines from the middle of the book that struck me as both scary, but also in a way exciting and hopeful. Henry writes, "The next decades will be an amazing time to live on this planet, and no one should be bored. Today's young will witness one of history's greatest struggles that will result in either one of humanity's most glorious triumphs, a successful energy revolution eliminating fossil fuels and their carbon emissions, or one of humanity's most dismal failures, the triumph of an entrenched carbon energy regime, the leaders of which are resisting the needed transition with stealth, trickery, and lies, and the consequent coming of yet more dangerous climate change." And I think the kind of knife's edge that you depict us sitting on is captured well by that paragraph. And I think one of the things that we forget is that there's enormous opportunity if we can succeed and embrace it in what lies in front of us. There's not only the mandate that we confront a really dreadful and terrifying future, but also the opportunity to create one that is actually much better, and to do so in a way that underscores the potential of human beings to rally around big things and to accomplish big things. And so for that reason, I found that an encouraging way of putting what is a serious problem. But the first question I wanted to ask you is, why do we need a moral case for climate action? Is your analysis that most of the cases for climate action hinge on some kind of predominantly selfish regard, and so you need a case that encompasses others? What's the case for having a moral case for climate action?
Well, in a sense, we don't need the moral case if we're only self-interested, because the case for climate action in terms of our own interest is enormous. We're like it or not, moving into a new climate regime. We're going to leave behind the age of oil and gas and move into a clean energy age. If we invest now in imaginative and ambitious ways in technology for the new age, we being the United States, can be world leaders in the technology. So it's enormously strongly to our advantage if we do that. And so that's one powerful argument, appealing to our own interest. But I think a lot of people, maybe not as many as you and I wish, but a lot of people do really care about something other than their own interest, and want, for example, to do well by their own children and grandchildren and future generations after that. So those are the people I've really written the book for. It's not that there isn't a strong case in terms of self-interest. There's a very strong one. But there's, I think, this other very powerful case that we can do spectacularly good things for future generations, and we can also impose on them some really terrific problems. So, as you brought out with that quote you read, I mean, it's an amazingly sharp knife edge in a way, that because the upside is really very, very good: cleaner air, better health, cleaner water, and avoiding all the things that come with climate change. And the downside is really quite scary. And at this point, both are open. I mean, that's the sort of fundamental message of the book: is this is it. We decide, and that's why we're the pivotal generation, using that, as you said, sort of broadly to include everybody alive, from the old granddad's age people like me to the children.
One of the things that you do in the book repeatedly is kind of tackle the question of time and moral obligation. It has become, in the last, say, half century, there's a very healthy school of political philosophers who tackle the dimension of space and moral obligation, and the question of what we owe to people who we may not ever meet on the other side of the planet, what our duties are to them. But you try to make a case for the fact of time's relevance being less than we kind of intuitively or have culturally come to think of it, and you kind of play on Faulkner's famous quip that the past is not even the past, and say that the future is not even the future. Can you say a bit more about how you think a proper understanding or a more enlightened understanding of time is important to understanding our obligations, particularly to future generations, and what's the mechanism there for that obligation, and why that creates a burden on us?
Okay, that's I'm still wrestling with this stuff myself, but it's been dawning on me that although in a perfectly reasonable way, we do divide time into past, present, and future, and for the most part, that's a very useful way to do things. The past is still with us in extremely fundamental ways, and we are actually shaping the future in very deep ways. And this is especially clear with climate change. One of the big fights in the negotiations has been about, naturally enough, about which nations should bear how much of the burden of dealing with climate change. And the poorer countries always point out that the richer countries, primarily through the industrialization process, are mainly responsible for having produced the climate change. And many governments, including the US government, has mostly responded by saying, well, those are our ancestors, nothing to do with us. You can't blame us for what our grandparents and parents did. But, and that in a way is to try to separate oneself from one's own past. But I think, among other things, that's just unrealistic. I mean, our nation wouldn't be what it was if we hadn't followed the path that we followed, that included our industrialization. And that's how we accumulated our capital, built our infrastructure, and all the institutions that we enjoy now. We certainly are not going to renounce all that. So it seems quite asymmetrical if we try to renounce any burdens that come along with it. And our reach into the future, I think, is even farther. One of the striking features of climate change is how extremely long time lags are. There's a physicist at MIT named Susan Solomon who sometimes says the ocean never forgets, like the elephants. And what she's talking about is the fact that most of the heat that's been held on the planet by the greenhouse gases so far is not in the atmosphere, it's actually in the ocean. And the ocean is very, very gradually warming. Sooner or later, there will be an equilibration between the temperature of the ocean and the temperature of the air, which means that heat will come out of the ocean into the air. And in the end, they'll be the same temperature. But this will take centuries. And it's just, I think, mind boggling, but also practically very important for us to know that emissions that we send into the atmosphere now are going to be affecting the temperature of the ocean, actually not just centuries, but millennia from now. Uh, so, uh, in a way, our hand is going to be uh, hanging on to the future, maybe lifting it up, maybe dragging it down. That's the question.
One of the again, getting at the kind of the root of the moral claim that you're making, one of the questions that occurred to me is whether there's an unacknowledged, at least not explicitly acknowledged on your part, aesthetic value that works its way into your understanding of what we're trying to protect in the future. If there's something beautiful about the world that is at risk, because the fact is that the people in the future for whom you're asserting obligations aren't yet people. And traditionally, we do think of only persons who are extant to be the receptacles of moral value, partly because the alternate view is that, there's a bunch of people who could exist right now who don't, and we don't usually spend a lot of time worrying about them. There are contingent selves. Each of us has contingent selves that don't exist, and we don't usually spend we might spend time regretting the decisions we've made that have eliminated them by not going to law school or whatever, but we don't spend time worrying morally about them. And so what's the root of the moral concern for people who actually don't exist yet, if not a kind of concern, a self-regarding but aesthetic concern for the beauty of kind of human life and its potential, generally speaking? And I wonder if it kind of compares to the pain that we feel when we find out about the extinction of a particular species maybe on a different continent, that has one particular species. I understand that, you can see that as an indication of greater ecological collapse or whatever, but if you take one species, there's something painful about finding out that something will never exist again. And it's not a practical pain. There's something aesthetic. I don't know what other term to use about losing the loss of that. And so I wonder if you could say more about why we really should care about people who don't exist.
That's a very probing question, and I think you're right both that it's important and that I don't do much with it in this book. I agree with you. I think there is what some philosophers would call intrinsic value. That is, there are things such that it's better that they be than that they not be. And for many species, this is true. The world is a more wonderful place if they are in it. And it's not that it's, it's better for us, you and me, but it's just better, period, because they are a valuable thing. And you're right that so far we've talked as if moral argument and self-interested argument are totally different things. But as I'm sure you know as well as I do, that's a somewhat artificial line. And one reason that I think we care about the future is that there are things now that we care about, institutions, say music or even sports. I mean, books, um, uh, comedy. I mean, just activities, distinctly human activities that we value. If we, I'm actually here referring to some wonderful work by a philosopher named Samuel Scheffler, who maybe you should talk to sometime. But Sam has this book in which he says, "What if I realized that because of some cosmic catastrophe, everyone was going to become sterile, and so there just wouldn't be any more people at all? It's not that everybody gets killed. It's just that the people who are alive all die naturally, and then there aren't any more people. How would that matter?" And one of the things he points out is, well, it would matter for all these other things we care about, the music and the sports and the comedy and the educational institutions and so on. They would also disappear. And so in wanting there to be a future society in which people can live a decent life, uh, among other things, we're wanting it to be possible for the things we care about now to continue and keep going. So in that way, it is to some extent for ourselves,
Mhm.
but it's also because those people will in themselves be valuable. And one of the disturbing things about climate change, of course, is that without meaning to, what we're doing is really threatening people of the future. It's not that if we wanted to be generous, we could um, somehow improve the lives of future people. That's also true. But with climate change, if we don't get serious and we just keep doing what we're doing, we're going to make the lives of people much worse. So we're really harming them. And I don't think a decent, reflective person does really want to do that. So it's important that we understand the danger that we might.
I want to shift to kind of thinking about the moral questions that surround how we might take action, and particularly the burdens of taking action. And before I do that, I want to invite our audience. I will welcome questions from the audience. You can put them into the comment box, and so welcome you to submit questions for our discussion and add to our discussion. But one of the things that and you've alluded to it already, one of the questions you dig into is kind of historical emissions and what obligations those might create. And I guess I want to probe that on kind of two levels. One is whether or not, and I'm being a bit devil's advocate here with you, but whether or not to claim that just because, say, the United States is responsible for, I don't know what I've seen different numbers, but one of them is 28% of historical emissions, that it should bear 28% of the burden. Doesn't that, in the same way that it's not the fault of an African country that they are coming later in the development cycle, and therefore, when the carbon budget is mostly used up, is it the fault in some sense of countries that developed first, that they came earlier, and by the way, the rest of the world in some way, not equal, but in some way benefited from the invention and innovation and new ideas, medicines, et cetera, that were part of that development process in developed countries. So can you really assign burdens based on usage when both the consequences and in some sense the benefits are not contained within the boundaries of a particular country? So that's one question. And the other question is more about, if we take as a premise your contention that it is truly urgent that we act right now, does it even matter who's responsible, as how we should allocate fairly the burdens of action? and might we not get wrapped around the axle of litigating what the fair allocation of burdens is when we actually don't have time for that, and it really just matters that we act. And is there in effect a moral risk that we spend too much time deciding no you have 28%, no it's 26%, when actually the planet is burning? So those are two questions with the kind of allocation of burden.
Let me take the second one first, because I wholeheartedly agree. The main thing is not to fight about who bears how much of the burden, but to get on with it. And it is very much a problem for us all. And it is true that those of us who historically emitted the most didn't mean to be doing any harm. We didn't know we were doing any harm. I mean, people in the 19th century, I don't even know if they had the concept of emissions. They just thought there's all this smoke and cinders. They certainly didn't think of climate change. I mean, a couple of brilliant scientists were beginning to figure it out, but I mean, the vast majority of people had no idea what's going on. So none of this is about blame. And I do think that the main arguments for action are not backward-looking ones. They're forward-looking ones. And they are the sort of thing we were talking about before, what one can do positively for future generations, and how one very much should, and I think most people do, want not to do any kind of harm to the future generations. But you also ask about the historical responsibility. I actually hesitated about putting that chapter in this book for exactly the reason your second question brings out, that I don't think we should spend all our time saying, well, is Russia as responsible as the United States, or only half, or 3 times as much, or whatever. Nevertheless, there was a tendency at the beginning of the negotiations for the people who understood about climate change to say, well, we've all got a problem here and we all have to do something. And the Indian representatives in particular, but other poorer country representatives, did say, well, wait a minute, who's this we? You did it. And in some cases, they really were casting blame. And I agree with those who say it's not a matter of blame, but nevertheless, there is the question, who should get going first on dealing with the problem? And one basis you can use is who's benefited the most from what happened. One basis you can use is who has the greatest ability to pay. There are these different possible bases for responsibility. But I think one is just who made the mess, not in the sense that who's to blame, but just on the general principle that the consequences that flow from your actions are yours to deal with, not because you've done something wrong, not because you're at fault, but just because they're yours. You did it. So if I spill the wine, I didn't mean to spill the wine. No one else meant to spill the wine, but they didn't spill the wine. I did. So I'm the one who should clean it up, not because I'm a bad guy, but just because that's my wine spill. So I should clean it up. However, just to come back, I don't think this is the main thing we should fight about. And one of the many reasons is if you get obsessed with it, am I doing more than I'm obligated to do? Of course, you'll be worried about, am I being a sucker, or the other nations taking me for a fool here? And there's been a lot of that. One of the reasons the negotiations haven't gone very well, I think, is people were quite preoccupied with that. The U.S. Senate was. I mean, there was one, the Kyoto Protocol, which some people will know about, was rejected in part because it didn't ask China and India to do anything, and I think that was a mistake. That is, it was a mistake to reject it because it didn't ask them to do anything. I also think they ought to be doing something, but these are different issues. So I think we should concentrate on how spectacularly beneficial a clean energy regime will be once we get it, and the importance of getting it before we screw up the climate any more than we need to. So be forward looking.
I want to come back to that because you have some interesting thoughts about trying to allay the kind of fears of overreacting in some way, as if that's a problem that we face today. I mean, we should be so lucky, but you have some thoughts about thinking through those moral what the moral weighings would be. You returned several times to a statement from the Trump administration from the COP in 2018, I think,
Right.
where the U.S. government said, among other things, we won't be party to something that dresses up claims to redistribute wealth as climate action, and obviously you found that objectionable for the way that the way that it rejects any responsibility for the situation that we collectively, the world, are in right now. I wanted to push you on that. Is it not, and far be it from me normally to be defending the statements of the Trump administration, many of which I publicly disagreed with, but is it not a problem for us that there are a number of governments, not people, but governments in less developed countries that are not only making claims based on financial interest rather than bona fide climate concerns, but also aren't responsible stewards of resources, and so are making those claims based on financial interests of a corrupt few, and asking for transfers that will not be invested broadly to support the welfare and the transition of their societies, or to make it a little less in the weeds. Is it a problem that actually taking action on climate change requires some kind of transfer of resources from the rich world to the poor world in order to help them make the energy transition, and we don't have uniformly high quality governance in the poor world, and so there aren't good stewards to do that? Is that a challenge, an unexamined challenge that we need to reckon with?
Well, inadequate governance is a problem all over the place, including the U.S. right now. So, I mean, there's certainly a problem that on both ends of the line we could use more responsible people, and I'm sure. I mean, I know that some governments are trying to use climate as an excuse to cream off some benefits that they would like, but I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that although we didn't mean to do any harm, we didn't intend to produce climate change, we have in fact produced a situation in which some poorer countries need to go through a rapid energy transition, which they don't have the resources to go through. We didn't mean to put them in that situation, and they certainly didn't want to be in that situation. But for example, there are, of course, many countries where not everyone has electricity. I forget the numbers now, but I think in India there's something like 800 thousand people at least, or that sounds too small. Anyway, there are a lot of people in India who don't have electricity. The easiest way for them to get electricity is to burn some really dirty coal, which is the most readily available resource that India has. It would be far better for us and far better for them if they skipped building coal burning power plants and went directly to solar, wind, and other clean energies. In some cases, they really don't have the money to do that. So I think it's reasonable that we should assist them, both because we contributed to the creation of the problem and because it's in our interest and the interest of future generations that they develop as cleanly as possible, though they do also really need the electricity. So we can't just expect them to stay poor. Sorry, that wasn't a terribly clear answer. I mean, I don't think climate change is sort of one big scheme to pick our pockets. There's some governments out there who will happily pick our pockets anytime they can. But in the case of climate, emissions need to come down very quickly where they're already high, and they need not to rise where they are now low. But many of the countries where they are now low can't afford to go directly to clean energy, and if left to their own devices, will develop using fossil fuels. And I think it's reasonable because of our contribution to the problem and because it's better if they can leapfrog the worst of the fossil fuel regime, that we assist them to try to do this leapfrog.
You're starting to get to something that you examine in the book, which is the fact that the climate challenge doesn't exist as the sole challenge in a vacuum, and that it is unfolding alongside an ongoing challenge with economic development, which is also essential to the welfare and the rights and dignity of persons in a number of places around the world where minimum standards are not yet achieved. Certainly minimum standards of security and welfare are not yet achieved. And so in some sense, the development imperative creates constraints for how we can address the climate imperative. And you seem to resist the idea that there can be trade-offs between poor people now and their interests and poor people in the future and their interests. And I wonder if you can dig into why you want us to avoid that as the place where we are negotiating.
Well, I don't think, in fact, there's a trade-off. I mean, I think if you really want to help the people of the present, you can help the people of the present. And if you really want to help the people of the future, the best way is to help the people of the present who will be their parents and their teachers and so on. So if you want better educated, healthier future generations in some countries, I think the best thing to do is to do what you can to have healthier, better educated people now. So it's not, I mean, it would be a terrible choice if you could, had to say, well, we can either help the people alive now or the later people. But I think that's just not a choice that we face. In fact, the way to help the future people is to help the current people. And I mean, it's not just that's help sounds like we're going to be doing missionary work or something, but I mean, the same is, think of it in terms of investment. I mean, I don't think there is a way that you could invest for the very distant future that would be better than investing in the intermediate generations who will then lead to the distant future. So I think that's sort of a false choice.
Do you think is there another choice though that happens if we just look at the present? If the most effective ways of reducing emissions quickly in the developed world are effectively market interventions that raise the cost of fossil fuel consumption and support the continuing to decline cost of renewables, and that in turn lowers the cost of fossil fuels on the global market and therefore creates incentives for poor countries. Is there a how do we reckon with the right to, I mean, what many poor countries claim as a right to development, and the fact that even as renewables decline in expense, the fossil fuels may indeed remain cheaper, and certainly with installed infrastructure and the rest of it, more cheaper in terms of cash flow demands than others, and that may be the best way of decarbonizing one part of the world, but it actually is going to recarbonize the other part of the world because of the way the market works.
Well, I wish our problem were low prices for fossil fuels right now, but I mean that is a real potential problem. I mean all these things are more complicated than we can really handle here. But in many cases, I think the best thing to do is to use the market where you can. But your question's bringing out the fact that there are limits to what you can do with the market. So, right, you can use carbon tax or carbon trading to drive up the price of fossil fuels. That'll make them more difficult for some people to buy. But once those people shift to some other energy source, there'll be less demand for the fossil fuel, and so the price would indeed go down. So I think at some point we may actually just have to say no more using fossil fuels. We're going to use the market and price mechanisms when we can, but at some point we're just going to have to leave this behind. That may not happen. I mean, as you alluded to, the prices of renewables have gone down so fast that there are very few places now where it's cheaper to use fossil fuel. The problem is that with renewables, most of the expense comes at the very beginning. I mean, it's very front loaded. You have to set up the wind turbines, set up the solar farms and so on. Once you get them set up, the energy's all free. Nobody charges for the sunlight or the wind. So once it gets going, it's not going to cost very much, but you need a lot of capital up front. And that's how we can really assist greatly, because in the poorest countries, of course, they just simply don't have this. There are a lot of very interesting entrepreneurial ideas that people are coming up with, like these companies that I think basically they sort of lease the solar panels to people, and then people just pay for their energy. And so the consumers of the energy don't ever have to actually pay for the solar panels. They just keep paying for the energy, but there's a little bit of a surcharge, which will enable the leaseor eventually to get their money back, and so on. I mean, so there are ways to fiddle around and make the market work with a lot of these things.
You one of the challenges of the moment that we find ourselves in is that we collectively appear to have made a implicit bet that technology, or rather a collection of technologies, will end up saving us, given our inaction or our insufficient action thus far, and the deadlines that we are told by scientists are looming.
Right.
There's, there's that old joke about the two men who meet on on a path in Ireland, and one says, "How do you get to Dublin?" and the other says, "I wouldn't start from here if I were you." And
Right.
um, if we were going to actually succeed in taking adequate action, we wouldn't start from here.
Right.
You try. I wonder if you can say a bit about the case against making that bet on technology or relying on that bet on technology, especially given the enormous expense of what the alternative is, because it is expensive to take the kind of action that we need to take. It
Yeah.
will have costs for the wealth. It will have costs for the consumption of people around the world, and depending on how those costs are distributed, it may have costs for elements of welfare that we are otherwise reasonably attached to from a moral perspective. It
Yeah.
might not be just that we're giving up designer clothes or whatever, but that some people are giving up some measures of physical security that are attached to certain levels of consumption. And so, how do we make the case against or how do we think through the trade-offs of making a bet on technology or a set of technologies, CDR, et cetera, saving
Yeah.
us?
Let me give the conclusion, lest the complexities of the arguments sort of bury it. The key thing is that we reduce emissions as much as possible now, and not count on uh, technologies to save us later, for a lot of reasons, and that's where it gets complicated. But the bottom line is there's nothing as good as not emitting any more carbon dioxide and methane than we can help. The situation is complicated because the fact that we've wasted the last 25 years means that it's almost certain that we're going to end up with a larger cumulative accumulation of greenhouse gases, and especially carbon dioxide and methane, than is compatible with a tolerable temperature. And so some carbon dioxide is going to have to be removed from the atmosphere. And this is not a mystery. I mean, trees remove carbon from the atmosphere now, plants do, so on. So it can be done. And there are some very primitive human technologies that can do it, though there are two things about them. First of all, they're extremely expensive, as you mentioned. And secondly, they're very poorly developed because the fossil fuel people haven't spent any money. I mean, I think there's a reasonable argument here that if you're selling an unsafe product and you know it, and you know that there are ways to make it safer, you should be investing in them. The oil companies have known about carbon dioxide removal in principle for a long time. They just haven't invested any money in it. So we have these possible technologies. We actually need some of them to do some work, but we're not sure that they can be scaled up uh, at great enough extent and soon enough to do the job. So this is just all the more reason that it's really crucial that we hold down the emissions as much as we possibly can, because the emissions are dangerous not only because when they're in the atmosphere they're driving climate change, but also because the more that's there, the more that would have to be removed. And we may well be lucky to be in a position to remove any at all. So it's very important not to say what some people are saying, these technologies are coming along. Who knows how good they'll be in 20 or 30 years. They'll just pull all this carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and we'll be okay. Could be, but it certainly could not be. And it's certainly not anything to count on. One additional reason why is if you bet on that, you're betting that future generations are going to be able to handle this okay. But if they're not able to handle it okay, they're the ones who are going to pay. So you're making a bet that the future generations are going to be okay. If the bet comes out badly, you're not going to lose, but they're going to lose. So we shouldn't bet on it, although we should. I'm not. One of the reasons it's complicated is I'm not against carbon dioxide removal. I'm not against research on it. I think it's a good thing to work on. I think the oil companies should have been working on it a long time ago. It's just that we mustn't count on it, and we certainly mustn't do less emission reduction because it might happen.
There's a degree of irresponsibility that attaches to that bet, both because the stakes are so high, and
right.
Missing it would be so catastrophic, and also because the stakes are not ours,
right, exactly.
in as much as they are other people's.
Yeah, it's a bet where we can only win. If there are losses, someone else will incur the losses. So it's, as you said, it's an absolutely irresponsible bet to make. It's like I bet, and if it goes badly, they shoot you. It's not a good idea.
Well, I mean, I hope that you care at least a little bit. If you lose
I
that,
would.
I want to ask a political question about a philosophical concept, or a concept, I guess, an economic concept with philosophical implications that you coin in the book. Anybody who took economics learned about externalities, and usually as externalities as things attached to firms or individual economic actors. And as you said in the book, for a variety of reasons, in most cases, those externalities, it's understood that it is good for the rules of the marketplace, in order for the market to be truly efficient, to force the internalization of those externalities, so that the costs that accrue to producing some output are accurate, and the pricing that results from it in the market is accurate. And you say that basically, as emissions are concerned, there has been a kind of sovereign externalization of the consequences of emission, which is all well and good, except who's supposed to do the enforcement of the internalization of those costs? And how do you think about the political challenge of the fact that that is, in some sense, the essence of the collective action problem we face? And to the extent that you're making a moral argument to Americans, or to people like Americans who are in developed societies that have benefited from sovereign externalization, what's the mechanism for ensuring significant action taken by a collective of these sovereign entities that need to take action?
Well, your background as a scholar of international relations is showing now. You're right. Of course, the international situation is in one sense fundamentally an anarchy. That is, there is no sovereign to enforce the rules, and so there is no one to force the externalization. So I think this is a case where there is only the moral argument. Maybe I should give a sort of concrete version of what this amounts to. In the climate change negotiations, the poorer countries now talk a lot about what they call loss and damage. That is, generally, people talk about three things. There's mitigation, which is reducing your emissions. There's adaptation, which is adjusting to the climate change that occurs because of the emissions that weren't eliminated. But now there's this third thing called loss and damage, which is dealing with climate damage that can't be exactly adapted to. I mean, there's a bit of a conceptual issue here about what counts as adaptation and what doesn't. But if, say, the sea level is rising near a coastal town, adaptation might mean either moving the town or building a seawall or figuring out some kind of drainage or something so that the sea level rise didn't make the town uninhabitable. Loss and damage comes up where the sea does inundate the town. Nobody was able to do anything about it, and now everybody's homeless, and there are no schools and hospitals and so on. So that's the loss and damage. You couldn't adapt, you suffered damage, but there's still there are bills to be paid to sort of adapt, except the adapting now is adjusting to a disaster. And the question is who should pay for the loss and damage. And the U.S., among other wealthy countries, have so far taken quite a hard line that this is not their problem, that they have a responsibility for mitigation, some mitigation. They might have a little responsibility for some adaptation, but people are going to have to deal with their own loss and damage. That seems to me to be analogous to classic externalization of costs and not be a fair or reasonable attitude to have, though there's nobody to enforce this. So if we agreed to pay for some loss and damage, we'd simply have diplomacy and, moral pressure to try to get other wealthier countries to do the same, and they might or might not.
We're coming close to the end of the hour, but I wanted to pick up on a point that you made that you almost made it. I mean, you have a section on it, but within a chapter, but it doesn't seem to be fundamental to your moral argument. But it did strike me as bracing and potentially persuasive politically in a sector of society that hasn't necessarily been as attached to climate action as an urgent imperative, which is the point that you make about other sacrifices and about the importance of making certain sacrifices now, which are sacrifices in order to address the existential challenge of climate change, and that if we don't do that, in some ways, we lose the value of other sacrifices that people have made in the past in order to get us to where we are today. And if you don't explicitly call out sacrifices made in the context of military sacrifice, in the context of war, but as we think about the generation that we're losing now, that had firsthand memories of World War II, which is the war to which we most often trace kind of the horrors of that war are the historical roots of what many of us to which many of us trace the origins of the international system that we know and its institutions, that they arose in no small part as a reaction to the horrors of that war, and that there were millions of people around the world who sacrificed, not as some of them as unwilling victims, and many of them as conscripted soldiers, but who sacrificed with a sense that there was a purpose to what they were doing. And obviously there have been other sacrifices since, both in a military context and elsewhere, but that if we were to lose everything now, we also lose what they sacrificed for, is an interesting point to make to a broader sector of society.
Yeah, I'm sort of bemused by this myself. I mean, this is not anything I had thought much about before. I tend to emphasize how the extent to which we control the value of the future, we can let it get wrecked or we can let it be wonderful. But in a way, we do also control the value of the past, at least to the extent of controlling how enduring some of the things are. So, right, somebody says, well, all these men and women died uh, to keep us safe. So now we're safe. But then if there's another enemy who comes along and we don't stop that enemy, then we're not safe anymore. And so, although these people died to keep us safe, they only kept us temporarily safe because we didn't do anything to deal with the next danger. And so, a legacy of theirs that might have lasted for a very long time only lasted for a short time because we blew it, and and in that sense, kept it from having the value it might have had. Uh, I don't know. I that seems right to me. I'd be very interested in what other people think about it.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful argument to make, especially in societies where honoring people who have sacrificed is part of the cultural morality that that we experience
Yeah,
in a variety of fora.
you
I'm
know,
gonna
William James had that book about the moral equivalent of war. If if it would maybe help a bit with the battle against climate change, if we could get that same sense that insofar as there are sacrifices to be made, this is really something heroic and worthy to do for the country and for future generations. Although at the same time, actually, very few of us are going to get killed dealing with climate change, so we shouldn't sort of overemphasize the sacrifice. People are also going to make fortunes in clean energy technology and so on too.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good place to sign off, because I think part of to obviously as a moral philosopher, I assume you think you're doing something other than shouting into the void, and especially with a
Not
book like
entirely clear.
especially with a book like this, the goal is to help people see more clearly the stakes and the reasons for their own action. And I think, as I said at the outset, I think one of the things that we understandably focus in moments of moral crisis on the moral wrongs or the moral dangers that are in front of us and that are happening already. But there's also, in moments like this, opportunities for moral beauty, in the sense of human beings' potential to actually do good things for each other and for future generations,
Right.
and to create environments, broadly construed, physical, political, etc., that allow for human flourishing. And I think not losing sight of that moment is part of the moral argument. That opportunity is part of the moral argument as well.
Yeah, I think it helps to ask how the future generations will look back at us. Will they sort of think of us the way we think of the people who fought the Second World War, or will they look back and say, what losers?
Well, that we will let that be the last word, with the hope that we won't be seen as losers. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, the book is called The Pivotal Generation. Henry Shue is talking to us from outside of Oxford today, and thank you very much for being with us, Henry.
Delightful to talk to you, Dan.
Thanks everyone for joining.